Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gats and gittens, mein Damen and Herren, brothers and sisters, welcome to another awesome, thought-provoking, curiosity-seeking episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me questions about what I do for a living. What I do for a living is I write comic books. Let's not waste another moment of your precious time. Christopher R. Taylor asks, Bucky Barnes, aka Winter Soldier, is very beloved by many readers, particularly those who grew up in the 1990s. But if I use your standards for examining a character that you listed, he seems to fall short. What's his motivation? What is his supporting cast? What are his goals? What does he stand for? Other than he looks cool and I like the story where he came back. What is he as a character? Am I missing something here? My main question about the Winter Soldier would be, where does he go when he's not in the comic book? What's he doing? Bucky to me is, when I first discovered Captain America in the early 60s, when Captain America returned, Bucky was dead, long dead. And a memory and something for Captain America to grieve. It gave Stan Lee and Jack Kirby used the memories of Bucky and Steve Rogers' regrets about his death. They used it to give the character weight, as they did with so many of the characters that they created. The Thing and Spider-Man and Bruce Banner and characters like that. These characters had tragedy in their lives, which gave them resonance. They're something we could relate to. So for me, Bucky was dead and should always remain dead. And of course, no comic book character is ever truly dead, especially if he can be brought back to increase sales. I have friends that worked on a lot of these, what are considered classic stories featuring Winter Soldier. Butch Guy, Steve Epting, among others. I never grew attached to this character. Your questions about him are on point, I think. Why does he exist? What's he want? And my question is, where does he go when we don't see him? Does he have any kind of life other than as a sort of a gimmick? I prefer my Bucky's dead. That's long story short. I couldn't get into this story. And it seemed kind of dark and dismal for a Captain America story. Dark isn't something I associate with Cap. Indomitable will and victory and never giving up is something I associate with Captain America. But I couldn't get into this story either. So I share your pain and disappointment. Craig S. He puts in, you recently mentioned that back in the day you used to tease Denny O'Neil about his Green Lantern, Green Arrow run and the socially relevant stories he wrote during that time. It sounds like Denny took it all in stride. I was really intrigued and was wondering, do you have a specific story you could share about those exchanges? I'd love to hear more, especially any thoughts Denny might have shared later about that run. I don't want to make it seem like I was being mean to Denny. I was working for the guy. He gave me the, one of the biggest breaks I ever got in the business. Him and Larry Hama and Archie Goodwin and Dean Mulaney are responsible for the big breaks I got in the business that kind of put me on the map. And Denny is probably the biggest because he brought me into the Batman offices, and that's where I spent, 25% of my career writing Batman. He knew where I stood politically. I knew where he stood politically, and I, expressed my opinion, to his face. I wasn't talking behind his back, and I didn't have a lot of respect for the Green Lantern, Green Arrow thing. And it was a touchy subject for him as well, not because of what I was saying, but because of his relationship at the time with Neil Adams. These two guys together, Neil Adams was key in bringing back Batman, to revitalizing Batman. Now, Denny was the key figure. It was all about Denny, because Denny worked with many artists during the period where he was, basically rebooting Batman, taking Batman back to his roots, removing all of the campy stuff that had been added because of the television show. And Denny was the man. He was the guy doing that. It certainly helped that Neil Adams came along and brought those stories to life. Now, the thing that may shock all of you and shock a lot of people even at the time was that Neil Adams was a fan favorite artist, but he wasn't a favorite artist with the regular reader. I don't know why, but regular casual readers of comics did not attach themselves to Neil Adams. He was not a big deal to them. He wasn't like Jack Kirby or Carmen Infantino, an artist that they really bonded with. Neil Adams never had that kind of following in the newsstand people that bought comics. He was a phenom amongst comic book fans, and I think that's what caused DC to basically let Denny and Neil run wild with Green Lantern and Green Arrow. They thought, hey, these Batman comics are selling so well. It's got to be this Neil Adams guy. DC was always getting things wrong. They're always looking through the wrong end of the telescope. It wasn't Neil Adams. It was Denny O'Neil's work that was lifting Batman's sales and creating a new audience for Batman. So they thought, well, let's put these guys together and see what they can do with Green Lantern, a failing title, a title whose sales are slipping. And they thought this combination was gold. It wasn't. It was DC's lowest selling title. That's why it didn't run very long. They kept trying to keep it going. They were getting some outside media attention. Does that sound familiar? New York Times review of books did a cover article about DC Comics, trying to be relevant, trying to take topical, political, and cultural issues of the time and insert them into comic books to make comic books more meaningful and grown up. And I guess DC liked that, but it didn't bring sales. I mean, even though Green Lantern, Green Arrow was brought to the attention of the general public, it didn't do anything to increase sales. Sales were terrible on the book, which is why they sort of ended that run. But yeah, I used to tease Denny about it, but it was all good natured. Denny was he was not an ideologue. I mean, he had his beliefs, which ran counter to mine, but he earned them. I don't know if you know this. Denny was a Navy man. He had been in the Navy, and he was on board a ship during the Cuban Missile Crisis off of the coast of Cuba. So, he used to tell some funny stories about the Navy, none of which are safe for work. So, ask me at a convention sometime. He told one story, man, it cracked up the whole room at a Batman retreat. And I know I'm teasing you, but no, Denny more than took it in stride. He thought it was funny. He knew where I was coming from. I knew where he was coming from, and it was all genial. Trust me. I never be mean to Denny. What a sweetheart of a guy he was. Kane Dorr. What was Dark Horse Comics like back in the day, and what is it like today? I know you wrote several books for them, but I'm wondering what the industry thought of them as a whole. I'm wondering what DC Marvel thought of them specifically. Way back in your Robin days, what did the industry think of Dark Horse? Also, what was your personal experience working for them? Anything stand out? Well, Dark Horse, they came on the map. There were a lot of startup comic book companies in the early 80s doing black and white comics, and that's how Dark Horse started out. They didn't do color comics. They arrived at the peak of the what was called the black and white comic glut, which, because of the success of Ninja Turtles, suddenly black and white comics were the thing. That's all the kids wanted, black and white comics. So Dark Horse jumped in and they sort of, they did okay, not real great. Didn't look like they were going to be around very long. And then they took a gamble. They spent a fortune. I mean, they spent big six figures to license the Alien franchise. And it was an immediate hit. And they followed up with Predator, and then the rest is history. They licensed more and more properties. They were seen as a licensing house, which I think is why DC and Marvel kind of left them alone. If you were an upstart company and DC and Marvel saw you as a threat, trust me, they would work through Diamond to put as many barriers in your way as possible. They did not like competition. But I think they saw Dark Horse as sort of an outlier because they were doing mostly licensed. And Dark Horse, even almost all of its earliest attempts to do its own independent material mostly failed. The Barbed Wire movie didn't go anywhere. What was that horror movie they did? I can't remember. Dr. Giggles or something like that. It didn't really take off. But Dark Horse wanted to be a Hollywood player and were, with Hellboy and things like that. Hellboy being, I think, their biggest success independently. Now, I don't know much about Dark Horse, what it was like. I never visited their offices. Like every other comic book company that I've been with, I didn't see a personality. It all depended on the editor. And really, I only ever worked with one editor at Dark Horse, and that was Dave Land. And I did some, I think I did a Predator story. I think I was assigned by Chris Warner a Predator story that I did with Kike Alcatena, and then nothing for a very long time. And then suddenly, Dave Land called me, and he asked me if I wanted to do a sequel to Dan Jurgens' Superman Alien crossover. And I said I did, but I did not want to do a direct sequel because Dan Jurgens' story was so amazing. It's one of my favorite comics of all time. I thought he just nailed it. I didn't want to follow his up because I didn't think I could improve on what he had done. And so I suggested, hey, I'll do it if I can do something different and a different approach, different tone entirely, and have Superman and the aliens combined with Kirby's Fourth World. And Dave Land and DC decided that was probably a good idea. They got John Bogdanove and Kevin Nolan to work on the art, and it was comic book heaven for me. I was working with two dedicated professionals. Bogdanove, as big a fan of Kirby's Fourth World as I was, and we were off to the races, and boy, did I have a lot of fun on that. And for one reason or another, Bogdanove had other assignments, and the project got delayed. We were like halfway through it, and Bogdanove had to work on something else. So the project was going to be delayed. This is the first time and only time this has ever happened in comics. Dave Land thought that I would be upset by the fact that the project was delayed, and he offered me another project as by way of apology. He said, would you want to do Superman Tarzan crossover? And it was like, yeah, that sounds like fun. And he gave me the basic premise of it, that basically Lord Greystoke and Clark Kent would switch places, and it would be set in the early 20th century, in the time of the original Tarzan novels. And I'm like, yeah, let me at it. That sounds like a lot of fun. And so I kind of went nuts on that and had a great time. And then it was Dave Land who assigned me the General Grievous 4-issue miniseries that I did for Dark Horse when Dark Horse had the Star Wars franchise. I got to work with Rick Leonardi, and that was a whole lot of fun, and the only Star Trek stuff I had ever done. And I really enjoyed working on that, and it was all because of Dave. And then Dave left, and that's the last time I ever worked for Dark Horse. So I really don't know what Dark Horse is like. I just know what Dave was like. He's a really cool guy. He was a lot of fun to work with. and he basically left me alone to do what I do. Now, the reason why I did one job for Dark Horse, and then it was many, many years before I did another one, there's no mystery there for me, because during that time, during my hiatus from Dark Horse, the editor-in-chief was Bob Schreck. And for whatever reason, Bob Schreck did not like me. He didn't like me any better when he came to work as the Batman group editor at DC. So, but he was stuck with me because, I sort of came with the house, if you know what I mean. And he really couldn't justify getting rid of me as hard as he tried to get rid of me and tried to justify, firing me off all of my books that were selling so well. So that's the reason why I didn't do any work, a lot of work for Dark Horse in that period. But the work I did for Dark Horse, I treasure all of it. It was all a lot of fun. So Dave Land, wherever you are, thank you a whole bunch. Rebecca Charland. This one's going to take a while, folks. Rebecca has some real insights here. From an outsider's perspective, it seems like shared universe type arrangements with multiple writers and creative teams contributing over the years invariably are subjected to periods of mass culling of established characters and places. Are these kind of creative mass extinction events an unavoidable bit of housekeeping due to narrative bloat and contradictions that build up over time, or are there other explanations? How is it decided who or what gets obliterated and what survives the event? As I listen through older episodes of your show, you sometimes speak of the illusion of change when discussing story arcs and events. This would seem to largely be true, with characters created in the 1930s or even earlier being still immediately recognizable in their modern and original configuration. But certain aspects of these characters and the worlds they inhabit have certainly permanently changed over time. What are your views on what can or possibly even should be changed permanently versus which elements of a story or character should be either only temporarily mucked about with or not even considered? Yeah, as far as, how is it decided what's going to be changed? Like when John Byrne came on the Superman titles and he got rid of like the Bottle City of Kandor and the mermaid character and a whole bunch of stuff like that. Or when Jim Shooter took over Marvel and got rid of the Savage Land because he didn't like the concept of the Savage Land. He thought it was a step too far. These things are decided by cult of personality. I mean, John Byrne came in and he was the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and he was making the decisions. And DC let him go. They let him have his head to decide what was canon now in Superman and what was not. Same thing for Shooter. Shooter was the editor-in-chief. His word was law. And if he wanted to eliminate the Savage Land, that's what they were going to do. And yes, over time, you're going to shed characters. My way of doing this was to simply ignore characters I didn't like. Lots of characters fade away. Harold, that little, little person guy who was Bruce Wayne's technical assistant for a long time in the Batcave, just sort of seemed to go away. Much like Ace the Bat Hound, who seems to come and go. Sometimes Ace the Bat Hound is there, sometimes he's not, in whatever form. So, these things are all done organically and everything else. The changes that I hate to see made with the characters are based on an idea that the characters they need to be updated for modern audiences. Those are the worst because those decisions aren't made from any kind of creative standpoint or to the purpose of creating stories or good stories. Comic book characters, more than almost any characters in fiction, really should exist in their own reality. And they should be free of the modern world or the ever-changing world or changing, pop culture and things like that. Case in point, in the 70s and 80s when Marvel reprinted Spider-Man. Um, they they went in and they rewrote some of Stan Lee's pop references. So instead of uh, you know a pop reference to the Beverly Hillbillies, it was changed to Michael Jackson. And of course, it was jarring when you read them because, as a reader, you understood these stories appeared in the 60s. And now all of a sudden the characters are making references to things, 20 years later. Yeah, you don't do that. And and then there's characters that sometimes, yeah, there's bloat and there's the cast gets enormous and you can't deal with it. But for some franchises like G.I. Joe, that's kind of the appeal. That the franchise is so huge and there's so many characters to draw on. And will Shipwreck appear? My favorite character. My favorite Joe that I played with as a child, will he appear in the comic? And how cool will that be? So there's all kinds of ways of looking at this. I mourn that the Bottle City of Kandor is gone. I love the Bottle City of Kandor. I don't know if it's ever been brought back. I I think the goofier aspects of the Superman mythos are my favorite. Super dog, super streaky, the super cat. The silliest parts of it are really the most charming to me. So so largely, these are done by cult of personality, either fiat from a creator who has juice, or an editor in chief who's taken over and is going to run the show, for better or worse. And there's a problem there because, and I'm guilty of this as well. You come in with your own prejudices. You come in to an already established franchise with, what you liked and didn't like about that franchise. Because most of these creators, I can't even say most of these editors anymore, but once upon a time, all of the editors were familiar with these characters. They had grown up with them or played a part in their initial creation. So they had skin in the game. They really cared about the future of these characters and how they were presented. And, they would have changes they wanted to make, sometimes good, sometimes bad. For every lost Bottle City of Kandor, you have, what Denny O'Neil did on Batman, which was, shedding the campy, goofy parts to make Batman a more serious character, which that is the core, that is the charm of Batman, as opposed to Superman, where the silly aspects are fun. The silly aspects in Batman don't work because that's not who the character is. In any case, these are all, personal prejudices. When Dan DiDio came in to take over DC, he had a lot of personal prejudices about how DC Comics were presented. And mostly his main prejudice was he would rather have been working at Marvel. So he didn't have a whole lot of respect for a lot of the traditions and canon of DC Comics. He was trying to make DC more like Marvel. And so he came in with, ideas established about DC, negative impressions of DC that he had gained as a comic book reader, as an adolescent. And if you're a real creative person, that can be a good thing. But if you're not a creative person, like Dan DiDio wasn't, it can be a disaster. And you're just going to go from one sort of heartless, soulless storyline to another until, the law of diminishing returns takes over. So yeah, it's up to the creator. It's up to the editorial staff. They have to come to an agreement. There's many, many times I, had to ask questions about continuity. How much can I get away with here? Particularly, I killed Mr. Freeze and then brought him back to life. That was deemed okay. Things like that. When you're working with these characters and situations that are, decades and decades old, go all the way back to the 1930s in some cases, you've got to make some allowances and you've got to set some ground rules and some framework what we're going to allow, what we're not going to allow. Unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, the multiverse has raised its ugly head, and so now they can get away with anything, and continuity's kind of thrown out the window. It kind of appeared when I was a kid, where if a character died or there was a horrible situation they couldn't get out of, they simply went to Earth 2 for the solution. I hated that when I was a kid. It was like, what a dodge, what a cop out that is. And now they do it constantly, to the point where both DC and Marvel's cinematic universes are threatening to follow themselves up their own butthole, using the multiverse as a gimmick over and over and over again. It gets to the point where if anything can happen, who cares what does? If you can find a ready solution by just sort of waving your hand and saying, well, we're gonna, pull the climax of this movie out of the multiverse, you kind of lose interest. I never wanted to go that route. Never did go that route. In fact, my series Law Dog is kind of a satire on all of that, or it can be read that way. It was certainly meant that way by Flynn Henry and I. Kieran Brunkard. What is the reason behind Batman loving his own city, Gotham? He has all the money and resources to move to a safer city like Metropolis, but he chooses to stay behind and protect the innocent. Yeah, why doesn't he just move to Barbados, or buy his own island, and live in peace? I don't know that he loves Gotham. It's a hard city to love. I mean, does it have does it have good schools and a nice art museum and a vibrant theater life? I don't think so. It just seems like a crime-ridden hellhole. It's partly depopulated because everybody that had any kind of common sense left a long time ago. So Bruce Wayne remains, and it's part of his vow. I mean, he can't save the world. He can't fight every criminal everywhere, but he can save one city, or at least slow the decline. I often think Batman realizes that he's in an unwinnable war, but he's not going to give up anyway, because if he doesn't do it, who's going to do it? And as you said, I think it's more about the innocent people of Gotham, the poor saps who can't afford to leave. It's like we see, in New York now, New York City, as New York City declines further and further, becomes too expensive to live in, too crime-ridden for you to want to live in. A city where the population seems to be divided between the really poor and the really rich. You're trapped and you feel bad for these people. And Batman, is fulfilling his vow to his parents, to, fight for the right and fight to protect the innocent. And what better place than Gotham? Because there's so many innocents under threat. What would he do in Metropolis? Just stand on his balcony watching Superman do solve every problem? A better question is, why isn't Metropolis an even safer place? Why, there should be a zero crime rate in Metropolis, and yet, giant robots and aliens show up regularly to knock down half the city. Peter Bowl. My question is about characters engaging in natural dialogue. I've tried to write dialogue and it goes well at first, but it comes to an end and it doesn't feel natural. I love the Alpha Core, and a scene I particularly love is the beginning where Brian heads back to Eagle's Nest and has a confrontation with Ingrid. The dialogue feels so natural, and I think on it regularly. How do you write a situation and have characters talk so fluidly? Dialogue is the thing I sweat more than anything else, because if the dialogue doesn't sound real or believable, or draws attention to itself, too much attention to itself, then I've failed. Dialogue is necessary to get information across, information about character, information about the plot, information about time and place, and things like that. But you can't do it in such a way that the reader feels like they're being lectured to or informed. It's like when you do educational material for kids, the last thing you want them to do is suspect that it might be educational. So you sort of have to spoon feed it, slip it in, figure out another way to do it. When it comes to dialogue, and I've said this before, and I'll say it a million times, there's no better person to study than Howard Hawks, the film director and producer, and in particular the movies of Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks was not a screenwriter. He was a director, but he was rare, especially in the heyday of Hollywood. He was a director who had a lot of respect for writers. He liked writers. He liked hanging around with writers and socializing with writers. He understood that writing is at the core of what makes a successful story, and particularly a successful movie, that it needs good writing. Now, Hawks worked in almost every genre you can imagine, from gangsters to science fiction to screwball comedy to crime and westerns. He worked with. He would pull together. Generally, his stuff was independently produced for the studios, and he would bring them, usually to Warner's, but he worked for RKO, other studios, and he would put together projects and pitch them. And once they were greenlit, he would go into production on his own. So he got to choose his own writers, and he would pick writers from all over the place. Hollywood was famous for plucking writers from the ranks of magazine publications and Broadway and places like that. And Hawks would have his writers, sometimes competing writers. For The Big Sleep, he had William Faulkner and Lee Brackett working separately on screenplays, and then brought them together and had them, along with him, pick out the best scenes that they had written. William Faulkner being a literary lion, famous literary figure in America, and Lee Brackett, basically, she was a pulp writer, science fiction writer, and pulp crime writer, and much junior to William Faulkner. I can't imagine her feelings when she's brought in, this humble, pulp scribe brought in to work with, one of the most famous and revered writers in the United States at the time. But Howard Hawks liked that energy. And what he would do is he would bring his writers together in like a social situation. And they would go, he had a house, it was in the mountains, I believe. And he would take his writers there for the weekend, and sometimes be a mob of writers, sometimes many as 6 writers. And he would take them up there, and they would have dinner, and then they would play with his model train set. And they would have long sessions in which they would hash out the movie script. And they would go over the script and over the script and over the script. And they would ask the same question every writer has to ask themselves all day long. Is, how do you say this better? Is there a better way to say this? And they would go over the dialogue and over the dialogue. And they would try to make it sound more natural, more invisible, make the writing more invisible. Hawks was all about hiding the story and hiding the dialogue. He was an invisible hand director. He didn't want you to think of this as a product of creative hands. He wanted you to just view his movies as an experience, this unique experience. And to do that, a large part of that was to make the dialogue as smooth and as natural as possible, as take any contrivance out of it to impart information. And his other gimmick was, once he had the dialogue nailed down, he would work with the actors in rehearsals, these grueling rehearsals before they went before the cameras, to make the actors deliver the dialogue in as natural a way as possible. If you ever watch a Howard Hawks film, you must watch Howard Hawks films to learn about dialogue. You'll notice that characters interrupt each other, that sentences are not completed, and all the information that you need as a viewer is being imparted to you, but in a very entertaining, funny, or suspenseful, or threatening, or romantic way. You don't even realize you're being informed. And if you watch one of the scenes where everybody's interrupting each other, you don't realize this is carefully choreographed. This isn't improv. These are lines these characters know they need to deliver. That I'm going to interrupt your line, and then this person's going to interrupt my line. And through this, group dialogue, we're going to inform the viewer of everything they need to know, but in a way that they didn't know they were getting it. Now, I'm going to give you some examples, of course. Into Have and Have Not, Howard Hawks' film, screenplay by William Faulkner, based on an Ernest Hemingway story. Walter Brennan plays this sort of functioning idiot who is Humphrey Bogart's sidekick throughout the film. And it's the typical, Walter Brennan, toothless, uh, sort of goofball character. And in in each time that Brennan now we won't now viewers knew Walter Brennan. They knew the kind of characters that he played. He played great villain, or he could play this sort of amiable doofus character, and they knew immediately what he was about. But how does he fit in the story? How does Walter Brennan fit into the story as Bogart's sidekick? Why does Bogart tolerate this guy? He basically ships out with him as first mate on Bogart's charter boats, and off the island of Martinique. And it's a great story. You got to see it. It involves Nazis and all the rest of it. Great wartime flick. Anyway, let's learn more about Walter Brennan's character and how he relates, and use him as a foil to explore other characters. So in the story, every time Walter Brennan meets a new character, he asks them the same question. Was you ever stung by a dead bee? And the reaction to him asking that tells you about the character he's just met. If they get irritated and everything else, we know, this guy's kind of an a-hole. He doesn't like the Walter Brennan character. He's kind of intolerant. Most importantly, when the Walter Brennan character meets the Lauren Bacall character, he asks her the same question. Was you ever stung by a dead bee? And she says yes. She says no. And she says, well, what would you do about it? And she said, I'd bite him back. And Walter Brennan starts laughing. Bogart laughs. And Walter Brennan says, that's what Harry said. Harry being Humphrey Bogart. Now, what does that scene tell us? It tells us that Bogart finds Brennan amusing, that they've had a long relationship, that they get each other. And also, it tells us that Lauren Bacall is pretty cool. She knows that she realizes early on Bogart has an affection for this guy, so she's gonna tread easy with him. She's not gonna be hard on him. She could be hard on people in this movie, and she's gonna, she's like, yeah, okay, I'll play along. And it tells us a lot about her character initially when we first meet her. And of course, we learn more about her and everything else. But our first impression is her reaction to Walter Brennan's, silly question. Now, an exchange I like a whole lot. It's in a movie called Red River, also directed by Howard Hawks. John Wayne movie with Montgomery Clift and Walter Brennan again, and Noah Beery Jr. And there's a scene in which they've hired a new guy to work the cattle drive, and he's gone off. And Montgomery Clift is kind of the ramrod of the outfit, and he asked Noah Beery Jr., you went off with Cherry Valance to buy horses. You came back and he didn't. It's like, so what's going on here? So we need to impart some information here. And Hawks and his screenwriters, Borden Chase, I forget the other guy who worked on this movie, have this dialogue that tells you what you need to know, also tells you about the characters, and adds resonance to the film. So the Montgomery Clift character says, Buster, where's Cherry? Noah Beery Jr. says, Cherry, well, he figured there was no need two of us coming. One was, he doesn't even need to finish the sentence, does he? Because the Montgomery Clift character's already sussed it out. And he says, is she pretty? Noah Beery Jr. says, oh, Matt, you remember that little filly I used to own? And Montgomery Clift says, that's what I thought. Now, of course, the scene and the dialogue tells us that Cherry is chasing some woman around. They want to buy horses, and Cherry stayed behind because he met some Bonita or Chiquita that he was attracted to. So that's all imparted here. But what else is imparted? What's imparted is that Noah Beery Jr. and the Montgomery Clift character share a past, that they're familiar enough with one another that Buster can just refer to a horse he used to own. and Montgomery Clift gets the picture entirely. And there's sort of, if you see that there's sort of this easy flow. I mean, this is naturalistic dialogue. It's not, and it's leaving something up for the viewer to fill in. It's also important. We feel engaged because we have to interpret what they're saying. It's like they've drawn us into their conversation. They're not telling us, hey, he's a, Cherry is a, he's a real wolf. He's a woman hound. He's, he's this, he's that. They're not telling us that as like sort of an outsider. They're bringing us into their world. They're bringing us into their conversation, and it's really engaging. And can you see, this is invisible handwriting? The intention of the writer is to do all of these things, but you're not aware of it. You're just brought in, and it's not a particularly funny scene or anything else, but it's imparting the information to you in as charming and as engaging a way as possible. And that's what makes natural writing. I know a lot of people, a lot of comic book writers, particularly like in the early 2000s, fell into this trap where they thought that, the kind of conversations they had in Seinfeld, or the kind of conversations they had that Quentin Tarantino would write, that could be aped, could be brought into comics as well, but not realizing that these conversations, both Tarantino and Seinfeld, don't really carry the story. They're just meant as observational asides or vignettes that don't really carry the story, and they are the furthest thing from invisible handwriting possible. And we know what the writers are trying to do. The writer's hand. I mean, I'm not putting the Seinfeld writers or Tarantino down. I mean, they wrote in a particular way, and it was very entertaining. One has to wonder, will the ages be kind to that kind of writing? But at the time, and even today, it's certainly entertaining. But it's not invisible hand, and it's not in any way natural. And that's the problem that a lot of comic book writers in the early 2000s made, was they thought, well, this is the way people talk. No, it's not. It's not. The way Montgomery Clift and Noah Beery Jr. here are talking is the way people talk. Interrupting each other, not finishing sentences. How many times you watch a movie and a person's asking another person questions, and they either don't answer or never answer directly or answer with a non sequitur? People talk that way. People talk that way. And in a movie, it draws you in. I mean, if you just had a person asking questions and another person answering them, well, that's not invisible writing, invisible handwriting. That's just exposition, Dr. Explaino stuff. And who wants it? So, so there you go. I probably have a whole lot more to say on this, but I think I've said enough for now. So if anybody wants to get in these specifics about how to write natural dialogue, but the thing is, if you're not sweating your dialogue, you ain't working. You're not working hard enough. You need to ask yourself over and over and over again, is there a better way to say this? Kieran Brunkard. I'm new to Flash Gordon. I haven't read or watched Flash Gordon before. Just started reading the run by Jeremy Adams and Will Conrad. Were Flash Gordon comics popular when you were growing up? I was certainly aware of Flash Gordon. Flash Gordon was a cultural touchstone from like my parents' generation. So you would hear things referred to, like modern space age things referred to as Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers, as a shorthand. And Flash Gordon was the Star Wars of its day. And it was, obviously fantastically drawn comic strip, Sundays only for a long time, written and drawn by Alex Raymond. Beautiful artwork. I've tried to read a bunch in collections, and the stories are really boring. I'm sorry, but the art's gorgeous. The art is just wonderful to look at, but the stories are kind of repetitive and boring. And but I can see why readers in the day thought this stuff was fantastic. My biggest introduction, my first introduction to Flash Gordon actually was as a kid, a little kid, like 5 years old. They would run Flash Gordon serials on local TV. And actually, I don't think it was local. I think it was network. Gabby Hayes. I was really, really little, like 3 or 4. Gabby Hayes had Roy Rogers' old sidekick, had his own kid show, and part of it was showing Flash Gordon serials. And then when I was an adolescent, like in junior high, they brought these things back, and Flash Gordon was on every day on one of our local UHF channels. So I got to see them again, and that was really the biggest impression that Flash Gordon made on me was these serials. But there were comics, mid '60s, when there was a little bit of a comic book boom with the success of Batman TV show. King Features, the syndicate that owned Flash Gordon, tried to get into the comic book business, and they did a series of Flash Gordon comics. A lot of them drawn by Al Williamson and Reed Crandall, and they were really hard to find. I don't know who was distributing them, but they were very hard to find. And I would buy an issue here or an issue there off of the newsstand, but mostly I had to go years later to comic book retailers. Back before there were comic book shops, there would be ads in the comic books for guys that would sell you comics, and you had to mail away for their little Xerox copied or mimeographed catalog, and then order out of it. So I was able to fill out my Flash Gordon collection. But it's not a character that ever made a huge impression on me. Though I did get to meet Buster Crabbe one time, and he signed a picture, a picture of himself drawn by Frank Frazetta. Obviously not an original, but he signed a picture for me. So great fanboy moment. And he had a handshake. Wow, he had a handshake like a vice. Twin spin for Kenny Todd. Did I get that right? Kenny, did you ask a question earlier? Anyway, doesn't matter. I don't have a staff, folks. I'm doing this all myself. Seat of my pants. Anyway, Kenny, if you didn't earn this one, you've earned one in the past. Also, in a Batman story, an Iron Ghost story, there were characters who talked about the Battle of Barbarossa. Oh, yeah, this is from the last episode. The Battle of Barbarossa. Is this like the country you said everyone you wrote has visited? How many other characters have been in the battle? No, it's not Bosco Verde. It's Barbarossa. And in Iron Ghost, I don't remember referring to it in any Batman story. Operation Barbarossa was the invasion of Russia by Germany in 1941. And it didn't go well. So obviously in Iron Ghost they would mention it because it was the beginning of the end of the Third Reich as the Russian winter set in and Operation Barbarossa ground to a halt. I could do a whole show on what how they messed that up, but and Barbarossa eventually leads to the Battle of Kursk, one of the to this day the biggest tank battle ever on the face of the earth, in which the Russians broke the back of the German army in Russia, and the retreat back to Germany began. And of course, that's all the setup for the Iron Ghost, which takes place in the final days of Hitler's Reich. Barbarossa came from Frederick the Great, the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the former king of Prussia, or late king of Prussia, long late. Barbarossa is a reference to the fact that he had red hair. He's wearing a wig here, but he had red hair. So Barbarossa was what he was affectionately called. Hey, have you thought about Subscribestar? Frederick Barbarossa certainly has. I'll put a link in the whatevers, but Subscribestar is a subscription, obviously, where you can subscribe to me And there's $1 platform and a $5 platform. And you'll get, when you join, you get some physical goodies. You get some signed comics and the rest of it. And then along the line, every once in a while, I'll send out some actual physical goodies. Subscribers got a free copy of the first book of My Sister Suprema. They also got a free miniature figurine of me, your humble host, of which I still have a few. And and every once in a while I'll send out autographed postcards, things like that. And every month you get digital goodies. They'll arrive in your email, and they might be things like my treatment that I wrote for Expendables 2, the rewrites I suggested, or any number of other scripts for unpublished projects like American Power and the Batman story that Brian Stelfreeze and I never got to do. Things like that could be your reward for $1 or $5. Now, what do I do with that $1 or $5 remuneration that I get each month? They go into a fund. They go into a bank account that pays my artists, letterers, and colorists on all the creator-owned things that I do. And I got a lot of creator-owned stuff coming up. And I've got to pay them. I don't pay myself. I don't make any money off of this. Someday I'll pay myself when these projects come to life and get crowdfunded or turned into movies or whatever. But I just want to create comics, and I can't, do it on my own. And my artists don't want to work for free, nor do I expect them to. So you go to Subscribestar for $1, $5, you get some goodies, and my artists get to eat. So Bruno Bookstore, this is where you reach me for questions, suggestions, pictures of your doggies and kitties. Send them along to brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com is the most reliable way to reach me. And that is it for this week. I want to thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing and all the wonderful questions. Keep them coming. I dig this. I like this.